This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. In part 3 of our shortcut series on the upcoming US presidential election, we're going to talk about the international issues at play. We'll look at where the candidates' relationships are with world powers and support for nations at war. We'll look at also where they sit on the big issue in this election, which is immigration. Squiz Shortcuts is the backstory to the big news stories. I'm Kate Watson.
And I'm Claire Kimball.
We're less than 2 weeks out from voting day. It's the 5th of November, Tuesday the 5th of November, I should say. Things are really getting down to the pointy end of this campaign. Last week, we talked through the big domestic issues. This week, it's international issues. Where are internationals in the pecking order according to voters?
It's a very good question, Kate Watson. So that Pew Centre research that we talked about last week, let's revisit that because it gives us a bit of a bearing on these top-of-mind issues. So domestic issues really are the ones that are coming up. 8 of the 10 are domestic issues. Foreign policy, that comes in on 4th of the list, pretty high. Yeah. I was a bit surprised about that. Immigration, which you could argue is a domestic policy issue, but for the purposes of today, we've put it in the international bucket. That comes in at 6th.
No surprise that domestic issues are always the biggest ones. And we talked about how big of a problem cost of living is in the US and why it's such a big problem and where each candidate is looking to address that in last week's episode. But as we said, this week we're focusing on all those big global issues. So there's no better place to start with the wars that we've talked about a lot over the last 2.5 years. Russia's war on Ukraine and Israel's war in Gaza. There's also broader conflict, of course, in the Middle East. The US is the biggest backer of both Ukraine and Israel.
Yeah, so I guess a starting point, America is no friend of Iran's. Of course, never has been. The terror groups Hamas and Hezbollah are backed by Iran, so it's noteworthy just to clock that Iran relationship. America's relationship with Russia has also been up and down over the years. However, it's in particularly bad shape right now. So these have been sort of front and centre issues, not just here in Australia as we look at the news, but in America as well. For 38% of registered voters, they say that Americans' foreign policy is top of mind.
And what we do know from looking at the data and the numbers is that this issue of foreign policy has increased in importance for American voters since the last election. So it is something that people will be voting on. Starting with Ukraine, the Congress has put almost US $175 billion to help Ukraine since Russia's invasion in February 2022. At times, that funding has been a battle for the Biden administration to actually get.
Yeah, I won't bore you with the details, but there have been times when the government has almost shut down because they've had these budget crisis talks and the Republicans and the Democrats not seeing eye to eye about those appropriations. So it's really down to Trump supporters not wanting America to be in the fight. Trump himself says that he would reevaluate the sort of support, particularly financial support, that America is giving Ukraine if he's elected. His running mate is J.D. Vance. He suggested that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky should actually basically surrender right now and draw a line with the territory that Russia currently has and just give it to them as a way to stop the war.
They say, so Vance says that would end that fight. That didn't go down well with Volodymyr Zelensky. For Kamala Harris's part, she said she'll continue to provide ongoing support to Ukraine to continue that fight. Onto the conflict in the Middle East, it's a security issue as well as an economic one.
Yeah, and I guess the thing to recognise here is that the US was already a very big provider of military support to Israel before the 7 October attacks. Since Israel's founding in 1948, it's received $158 billion in military aid from the United States. So it's quite a lot of money. It's the greatest recipient of support from America and has been across its history. So it's a long and deep relationship. And of course, there's been a lot of extra support in the last year.
Across the last year, that covers everything from bombs and fighter jets, help with the Iron Dome air defence systems, sending more fighter jets and warships within the region as a deterrence. The history is that the US has been on Team Israel, Claire, from the very beginning.
Yeah, literally from the start. So America was the first nation to recognise Israel when it was created back in 1948. And look, there's there's alignment on principles, I guess it's worthwhile calling out. Israel is a democracy and it has Western values. So there's a natural alignment there. There's economic alignment too. The United States does not want a spike in oil prices.
And that's something that tends to happen when there's instability in the region. The bigger strategic picture is that Israel is at the forefront of that region and keeping Iran in check as well, of course. To bring it back to the US election, though, there have been mass protests of college students and clashes between pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian groups in America that have turned violent. It's a really, really emotional issue.
Yeah, and it's an issue that they say could actually sway some voters, particularly younger voters, when it comes to who they'll support in this election, whether they'll support the Republicans or Democrats. As for the candidates, Trump is a staunch supporter of Israel. He's met with Netanyahu this year, Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, Israel's prime minister. In August, he said that he told Netanyahu to end the war, but he added, and this is the quote, he knows what he's doing.
Harris has also said she's fully committed to supporting Israel. She's continued to call for a ceasefire. She's also expressed sympathy for the plight of Palestinians killed in Gaza. That's a position she's hoping will help her in states like Michigan in particular.
Michigan is home to the country's largest Arab community, so definitely keep that one on your radar as we're getting to the pointy end of conversations about those really tight races.
Were they one of the 7?
Bingo.
That's a reference to our first episode,
yes,
which steps through all the seats here. States to watch as we get closer to the count.
Yeah.
Moving on to China. So China is obviously a big topic of conversation. Harris's running mate, Tim Walz, we've talked about JD Vance, but Harris's running mate is Tim Walz, has what he says is this is a quote, deep affinity and connection to China. He taught there early in his career. He's visited many, many times. That's been turned into a negative by the Republicans.
Yeah, particularly in the early days after the announcement that he was going to be the vice presidential running mate, when they're trying to find something to really talk about him. The Republicans said that Walz was potentially too pro-China, and that was something to keep an eye out for. But Walz since then has been really critical of China, particularly under the leadership of President Xi Jinping. He's talked about their poor human rights record as well. Harris says that she's going to continue with Biden's tough approach to China. There's been a whole lot of stuff over the years around trade and around relationships and that human rights conversation. America has, in more recent times, tried to disrupt China's market and its market dominance over supply chains, big supply chains. The one to call out is particularly in renewables.
So we're talking about things like processing of critical minerals, which are needed for producing batteries in EVs, solar panels, wind turbines. Interesting to note too, the Biden administration's China policies were really just an extension of Trump's China policies. What is the point of difference here is not always that clear.
Not always that clear. And actually there was a lot said after the election of Joe Biden that he would scuttle so much of Trump's policies across government, but the one thing that he kept pretty close to was actually Trump's approach on China. So, when we look at the sort of difference without a distinction, China certainly is one of those sorts of things. He's planning, though, Donald Trump to go pretty hard on China again. Trump has a plan to slap a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports. It's a lot. That's a big tariff to put on the price of things. And that's on top of tariffs that have already been introduced. They started that process back in the Trump days.
Well, he also has a plan to put 10 to 20% on all international imports. Many economists say that will have an impact on the cost of goods for Americans. It could backfire if countries retaliate. We've sort of seen this movie before, though. I mean, he was president.
Yeah, it was really the start of these sort of trade wars that Trump was absolutely bringing this America First agenda into trade relationships. That was something we talked about a lot back in those days. I guess if we could relate it all back to Australia, though, there are concerns for our exporters about what that might mean. There might be some carve-outs, though, if it is that Donald Trump is elected and we can do deals with him perhaps.
Probably also good to just mention positions on AUKUS,
or
at least what we know about AUKUS. So that's that security pact between the US, the UK and Australia. It exists because of China's ambition to be more dominant in our region and the world. What does Kamala Harris say?
So steady as she goes is Kamala
Happy with
Harris.
it?
She's committed to exactly what the Biden administration has done. I had to go back in time and actually think about how that whole arrangement came about. I kind of had in the back of my head that those conversations started between Scott Morrison and Donald Trump, but it wasn't. It was actually post-Trump's era in the White House. So it's a question then about her just doing exactly what has been on the plan from the get-go. When it comes to Donald Trump, though, there's lots of nervousness about how he might approach it.
He does tend to not like these big international agreements. So whilst he hasn't sort of said what his plans are, there is a lot of people sort of curious about how he might approach something like AUKUS, particularly given he wasn't the creator of it and the instigator of it. Our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, reckons AUKUS is safe no matter who wins the US election. It's an expensive conversation, I guess, just to close this one out, because under the agreement, the US is building us some nuclear subs. They cost a lot. What was the number again?
Like the whole agreement is something around $360 billion. And a big slab of that, of course, is building these nuclear subs and actually helping America gear up to build them. So it's billions and billions and billions of dollars.
So any change is a really
big deal.
Let's leave that there. Immigration, Claire, Donald Trump has made it one of the pillars of his campaign. It's something his base is really concerned about. 82% of Trump supporters say immigration will influence how they vote, compared with just 39% of Democrats.
Yeah, it really is a big issue for Republicans. It's second only to the economy in importance when it comes to Republican voters. What this comes down to is America's migrant population rose by 1.6 million last year, so in 2023, the largest increase since 2000. So that's just something to clock. Since 2021, people have been fleeing gang-related violence, also economic ruin, environmental disasters in what they call the Northern Triangle. Those are the countries in Central America that take in Guatemala, Honduras and El Salvador.
As for how the Biden administration have handled this, and I guess it's important to talk about that because obviously Trump was president at a time, but we've had 4 years of another government. In early 2021, President Joe Biden gave his vice president the job of dealing with the root causes of Central American immigration. Kamala Harris was his vice president.
Yeah.
To be clear, though, this is where we had to just do some fact checking. Harris wasn't actually in charge of the border. That was someone else's job. But the Republicans and Trump have called her the border czar, that she was the person in charge. They've characterised her as that. And the Democrats have had a hard time ever since sort of shaking off public perception that she's weak on border control.
Yeah, and that's borne out in the polling numbers as well. So according to the stats, 52% of registered voters say that they would trust Trump more with the immigration system and making decisions about border control, compared to about 45% who say they would trust Harris.
This isn't new territory for Trump, though. He knows what he's doing on this.
It really isn't. So he entered the fray on immigration back in 2016 to huge effect. He talked about the jobs of Americans being taken over by migrants. And in this campaign, he's made big headlines talking about Haitians living in Springfield, Ohio. He says that some of them were killing and eating pets.
That was a really big deal after that first debate. That was sort of the talking point from that debate. Lots of people saying that's absolute nonsense and that never happened. It's mostly unauthorised migrants he talks about the loudest, I guess. He reckons they're linked to an increase in violent crime, gangs and drug running. He says those people are poisoning the blood of our country. That's his language.
Yeah, exactly right. And just to give you some numbers again so you can get your bearings.
So many numbers.
I know, but it's just important to getting the scale of things, I think.
And they're kind of fun to repeat back to conversation, aren't they?
Right. So clock this one in your pocket and you can take it out at the next conversation you're having about this. 47.8 million immigrants are living in the United States. 77% of them are there legally. About 23 are undocumented. Many have come over that US-Mexican border, and that's an ongoing hot topic.
Yeah, 23%. You'd remember Trump's big promise when he campaigned for president in 2016. Well, you would remember this, Claire. But I think most people will remember this, to build a big, beautiful wall. He did build that wall. Around 738 kilometres of that wall was built, but construction stopped when the Biden administration took office in 2021. Trump's vowed to complete it if he wins, but the number of border encounters is actually down. So that's people being caught coming into the country illegally. That peaked with 250,000 in 2023 to just under 59,000 in August.
So a lot has happened over the last year. It was a really big topic of conversation in the news about that high number of people coming over the border just 12 months ago. When we think about, of course, this conversation in Australia, and you get a boatload showing up off the coast of Western Australia with 250 people, they were talking about 250,000 people basically over that year. So it's a lot. And look, the experts reckon that the reason it's down is that there's been quite a few policy changes on both the Mexican side and the American side. So Mexico's doing a lot more to prevent people from reaching the border. That's been a discussion that the Biden administration has had with them. On the American side, they've introduced daily caps on migrant intakes, and also there's stricter rules when it comes to claiming asylum.
Yeah, the other solutions Trump's spoken about, mass deportations, is part of his policy of undocumented migrants, and possibly sending the military into major cities to, his language again, crush the gangs. Harris has some policies too.
Yeah, she's not talking about sending the military in, that's for sure. But she certainly supports restrictions on asylum and also penalties for people who are picked up multiple times trying to come across the border. She's talked about tackling the drug cartels. Of course, she's the former Attorney General in California, so that goes to her sort of tough on crime kind of stance.
Yeah.
Also talking about creating pathways to citizenship for children of illegal migrants.
Yeah, that's something close to her heart because, as she's told countless rally crowds, she was once a child of immigrants. She had the chance to grow up in the US and she's now running for president.
Living the dream.
The American dream.
Yeah.
She sure is. That's your shortcut to the foreign policy issues in this US election. On to our recommendations. My recommendation, Claire, we often do this for the reading, listening or watching on a given topic. I might have recommended this one in our weekly wrap podcast, so apologies if I've already done it. But Four Corners did a special from that border wall.
Yep.
I don't know. I'd never really seen it in the way that I sat down for an hour and actually watched Mark Willisey walk along it. Talk to people who were crossing it. So I found it really useful.
Yeah,
So
and talk to
those
officials and agents who are trying to enforce the law on the border as well.
And also people who have very strong views about people coming across and why they have those views. So, yeah, that's my recommendation.
Good one. I've got an article from the Financial Times. It's about China and policymakers in China and Chinese people more broadly and how they're looking at the United States election. Of course, during the Trump years, it was pretty tumultuous. So they have views about Donald Trump. They've also got views about how the Biden administration have handled things and how things might be under Kamala Harris. So it's just a good read if you're interested in that China angle.
Links to all of those are in your show notes. As always, thanks for listening. We've got 2 more episodes. Of your shortcut to the US election.
Yeah, so next week we're going to be talking about how things are landing ahead of polling.
So polling, lots of polling conversations.
Yeah, exactly, and just the politics of how things have really been going. Back to your favourite topic, Kate, politics of it all.
The polling's important in the week leading up to the vote because you need to repeat some polling information to people when you're talking about it, I think.
Where are things going to go?
And it's,
where do they reckon? So we'll do that. And then the week after, it's the result.
It's the result. So we will wait for the result and then we'll do a sort of sprint through what actually looks like it's happening. We may not have a result, may have a result, who knows. Find out in a couple of weeks. Exactly. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you are enjoying these episodes, please share it with anyone you know who is also interested.
Or
in
everyone you know, even if they're not interested.
Yeah, they might get interested.
Exactly.
Who knows? Till next week.